The world almost ended on a Tuesday. Not from a war anyone planned. Not from a political decision made in a room full of generals. Not from a missile that was actually launched. From sunlight, bouncing off the top of clouds, over North Dakota, at 12 in the morning. And the reason you are alive right now, the reason every single person you have ever known is alive, comes down to one man, sitting alone, in a Soviet underground bunker, staring at a screen that was screaming at him that 5 American nuclear warheads were inbound, and the world was about to end. He had a phone in his hand. Protocol said pick it up. He didn't. His name was Stanislav Petrov. He was 44 years old. He was not supposed to be on duty that night. The officer scheduled for his shift had called in sick. Petrov was filling in, and the historians who have studied this incident most carefully agree on one thing. If any other officer on that base had been sitting in that chair, they would have made the call. They would have followed the protocol, and we would be talking about World War III, if anyone was left to talk at all. By 1983, the United States and the Soviet Union had between them roughly 60,000 nuclear warheads. Each side had enough to destroy the other's entire country multiple times over, and each side had a doctrine to go with it. It was called mutual assured destruction. The logic was simple and terrifying. If either side launched a first strike, the other would detect it within minutes and immediately launch everything they had in return. Both sides would be annihilated simultaneously. The guarantee of mutual annihilation was supposed to stop either side from ever going first. It worked until the day a satellite mistook sunlight for a missile and a single officer had to decide whether a computer was telling the truth. The Soviet early warning protocol was absolute. If the system detected an inbound missile, the duty officer confirmed it and reported it immediately. No independent analysis, no waiting, no second opinion. The entire philosophy of nuclear deterrence was built on speed. If the Soviets hesitated even a few minutes, the American warheads would land first and destroy the Soviet ability to respond. Every second of delay was a second closer to losing the war. So the protocol said, report immediately. No exceptions. Petrov was staring at 5 exceptions. To understand what Petrov did, you have to understand what 1983 felt like inside the Soviet Union. The Cold War had been running for nearly 40 years. Both sides had been pointing missiles at each other for so long it had become routine. But 1983 was different. 1983 was the year the tension broke through the surface.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire
In March, President Ronald Reagan delivered a nationally televised speech calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Inside the Kremlin, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, already gravely ill, deeply suspicious of American intentions, and surrounded by military advisors who believed Reagan was genuinely preparing a first strike, heard that speech and took it as confirmation. He authorized a massive global intelligence operation called Operation Ryan. Its sole purpose: find the early warning signs of an American nuclear attack before it happened. The Soviet military was placed on alert. Not a drill, not a procedure, a genuine heightened readiness. Because the people at the top of the Soviet chain of command believed that Ronald Reagan might actually do it. Then on September 1st, 1983, exactly 25 days before Petrov's shift, a Soviet fighter jet shot down. Korean Airlines Flight 007, the civilian passenger aircraft, had drifted into Soviet airspace. All 269 people on board were killed, including a sitting U.S. congressman named Lawrence McDonald.
Soviets have recovered some of the bodies from the Korean airliner shot down by a Soviet fighter plane.
Reagan condemned it as a deliberate massacre. The Soviets accused the U.S. of using the plane as a spy mission. Every diplomatic channel between the two superpowers effectively went silent. This is the temperature of the world when Stanislav Petrov sat down for work on the night of September 25th going into the early hours of September 26, 1983. Stanislav Petrov was not a career combat soldier. He was an engineer, a software engineer, who had helped design the very system he now monitored. He had come up not through the brutally rigid Soviet military hierarchy that trained officers to execute orders instantly and without question, but through technical research. He understood the system from the inside. He knew how it worked, and he had always carried a private doubt about it. The system was called Oko, the Russian word for eye. 9 satellites in orbit above the Earth, scanning the United States continuously, searching for the infrared heat signature of a ballistic missile launch. The data flowed to Serpukhov 15, the classified underground command center 60 kilometers south of Moscow. If Oko detected a launch, Petrov's job was mechanical. Confirm and report immediately. In Petrov's own assessment, the system had been rushed into service. He considered it raw. There had already been anomalous readings. He understood exactly how it could fail. None of that was protocol. Protocol was pick up the phone. Shortly after midnight, the siren in the bunker exploded to life. A panel across the room lit up in hard red letters. One word: launch. The system was declaring maximum confidence. One U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile had been detected launching from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. It was tracking directly toward the Soviet Union.
Случилось неожиданно, как всегда.
Staring at the screen with the word launch displayed in bold red letters.
Petrov said later, the siren howled, but I just sat there for a few seconds, staring at the big, backlit, red screen with the word launch on it. Then the screen updated. Not one missile. A second alarm. A third. A fourth. A fifth. The computer cycled through their detection algorithm. The readout changed from launch to missile strike. 5 US Minuteman ICBMs, all bearing toward Soviet territory. The system had run the data through 30 separate layers of automated verification. Every single layer confirmed the detection. The confidence rating on screen: read 3, maximum the highest number the machine could produce. Every operator in the bunker was staring at Petrov. He had the phone in his hand. His superiors were on the other end. All he had to say was attack confirmed. From there, the information would move up the chain. Petrov to headquarters, headquarters to the general staff, general staff to Andropov, who would authorize the retaliatory strike. The entire nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union, pointed at the United States and its NATO allies, would launch within minutes. Petrov said all I had to do was reach for the phone, to raise the direct line to our top commanders. But I couldn't move. I felt like I was sitting on a hot frying pan. So instead of moving, he thought about 5 missiles. His entire career, Petrov had been trained to understand that an American nuclear first strike would be massive, overwhelming. The entire point of a first strike was to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to respond before a retaliatory launch could occur, which meant you needed hundreds of warheads, maybe thousands, hitting dozens of targets simultaneously. You could not achieve that with 5 missiles. 5 missiles against the Soviet Union was not a first strike. 5 missiles was barely a provocation. Nobody starts a nuclear war with 5 missiles. He thought about the ground radar. If 5 real Minuteman missiles were genuinely in flight over the Atlantic, the Soviet ground-based radar installations positioned across the USSR to detect missiles rising above the horizon should also be picking them up. Ground radar confirmation was exactly the kind of independent verification the protocol was designed around. He checked. Ground radar was completely silent. No confirmation, not one blip. He thought about the system itself. New, rushed into service. His own private doubts. He later said the message had passed through the 30 verification layers too quickly. The speed of the confirmation was itself suspicious, as though the system was cascading an error rather than independently verifying a real event. He thought about all of it in the seconds between alarms. He was not certain. He acknowledged afterward that at the moment he made his decision, he estimated the odds at roughly 50-50 that the missiles were real. He said he didn't want to be the one responsible for starting World War III. He picked up the phone and reported to his superiors. False alarm. Then he waited. For 23 minutes, Stanislav Petrov sat in that bunker and waited to find out whether he had just condemned his country to destruction or prevented the end of civilization. He later said, "There was no rule about how long we were allowed to think before we reported a strike. But we knew that every second of procrastination took away valuable time which the Soviet military and political leadership needed to be informed without delay." 23 minutes later, nothing had happened. No detonations, no second wave, no ground radar confirmation that ever came, no war. He said, 23 minutes later I realized that nothing had happened. If there had been a real strike, I would already know about it. It was such a relief.
Лично, что меня никто не поправит.
The investigation that followed traced the false alarm to a single satellite, Cosmos 1380, on the morning of September 26, 1983, a rare atmospheric alignment had occurred. The Soviet satellites were in a Molniya orbit, an elongated, elliptical path that brought them to a high point, above the northern hemisphere during peak, monitoring hours. At a specific moment in that orbit, sunlight was reflecting off the tops of high-altitude clouds above the state of North Dakota, at precisely the angle that the satellite's infrared sensors registered as the heat signature of a Minuteman ballistic missile launch. The software that was supposed to filter out exactly this kind of atmospheric anomaly failed to do so. The false reading passed upward through 30 separate layers of automated verification, each layer designed to catch errors, and every single layer confirmed the false data as genuine. The machine was not malfunctioning in the way machines usually malfunction. It was functioning exactly as designed. It was just wrong. Petrov described it later with a precision that is almost beautiful. Can you imagine? It was as though a child had been playing with a vanity mirror, throwing around the sun's reflection, and by chance that blinding light landed right in the center of the system's eye. Sunlight off clouds above North Dakota nearly ended the world. The error was later corrected by cross-referencing a geostationary satellite, an approach that should have been built into the system from the beginning. The OCO system had the technology to cross-reference. The engineers had simply not implemented it for this type of anomaly. The system that was supposed to protect the Soviet Union from surprise nuclear attack was not cross-referencing its most critical detection data. Petrov had built part of that system. He had known it was not ready. He was right about that too. What followed was one of the most quietly devastating institutional responses in Cold War history. Petrov's superiors praised him privately. General Yuri Votintsev, commander of the Soviet Air Defense's missile defense units, told him his actions were correct. He was promised a reward. The reward never came. The incident had exposed catastrophic flaws in the OCO system, flaws that embarrassed both the military officers who had approved it and the civilian scientists who had built it. If Petrov was officially rewarded, those responsible for the system's failures would have to be officially held accountable. So instead of a reward, they found something to reprimand him for. Not the decision. They could not reprimand him for the decision because the decision was correct. They reprimanded him for failing to properly document the incident in his military logbook during the event. He had a telephone handset in one hand and an intercom in the other. When the alarms were going, he later explained, "I had a phone in one hand and was writing in the other. That's why my notes were a mess." They reprimanded him for not writing clearly. He spent the next 3 days in the bunker while a special commission investigated, unable to sleep, locked on the screen, waiting for the commission to decide what to do with him. When he finally went home, he was completely exhausted. He slept. Then they reassigned him to a less sensitive post. Then he took early retirement. Then he had a nervous breakdown. The Soviet government classified the entire incident. Petrov was told not to discuss it. His wife Raisa lived with him for 10 more years without knowing what had happened. When she finally asked what he had done the night, he came home so quietly and so drained. He said, "Nothing. I did nothing." The story did not become public until 1998, 15 years later, when General Votintsev mentioned it in his published memoirs. The world learned that for 15 years, a single Soviet officer's private decision, during 23 minutes, alone in a bunker, had been the only thing standing between civilization and its end. Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017. He was 77 years old. He died alone in a small apartment in Friazino, a suburb of Moscow, from hypostatic pneumonia. His death went completely unreported for 4 months. A German journalist who had befriended him eventually disclosed it. In his final years, he grew his own potatoes to eat. His army pension was modest. He received a handful of international awards late in life. A World Citizen Award in 2006 and a $25,000 Dresden Peace Prize in 2013. A 2014 documentary called "The Man Who Saved the World" was made about him. A posthumous $50,000 Future of Life award was presented at the United Nations in 2018, collected by his daughter, because the American embassy took too long processing his son's visa. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said at the ceremony, "It is hard to imagine anything more devastating for humanity than all-out nuclear war. Yet this might have occurred by accident on September 26, 1983, were it not for the wise decisions of Stanislav Petrov." The Russian government never recognized him. They maintained that a single officer could not have prevented a nuclear war. Bruce Blair, one of America's foremost nuclear security experts, who studied the incident closely, said, "I think this is the closest our country has come to accidental nuclear war." Petrov spent the rest of his life saying he was not a hero. He said he was simply the right person in the right place at the right time. He said all he did was his job. When his wife asked what he had done that night, he said, "Nothing. I did nothing." What he actually did was sit alone in a bunker for 23 minutes, with a computer screaming at him that civilization was ending, and trust his own judgment over a machine that 30 separate layers of verification had confirmed was telling the truth. The officer scheduled for that shift had called in sick. Petrov happened to be there, and you are here.